Thanks, John, so much for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here with you all for the Faith and Sport Forum this evening and really talking about a topic that means a lot to me personally and professionally. So to be able to come and share my experiences that I've had with you, not only as an athlete myself, but also what I've been learning about specifically mental health in the research I've been doing and also the clinical work I've been doing. I'm really excited to kind of be a part of that this evening. So I'm going to quickly get my presentation shared and then we'll get going. So before I kind of start and dive into the presentation, I want to give a little bit more context about why this topic is so important and meaningful to me personally. I grew up in the sports world and started becoming a competitive athlete when I was 7 years old and kind of dabbled in a lot of different sports, but really it was swimming was the sport that really I kind of dug into and really put a lot of time and energy and effort into developing that part of myself. Through my athlete experience, I learned a lot personally about myself and just how far I could push myself physically and mentally. But it wasn't until, honestly, I went into my master's in counseling program that I really started reflecting on my own journey and my own athlete identity, kind of in a grander perspective, specifically around the role that mental health played in my own experience in sports culture. So that really is what has driven my own passion around this, specifically because growing up, as I thought back and reflected on my own experience as an athlete, we would have coaches that would bring in professionals from all different backgrounds. So we would have personal trainers come speak to us. We would have nutritionists come speak to us. We would have physical therapists come speak to us, all really trying to help us be the best we could be physically as an athlete. But there was really no conversation around mental health. And that really made me realize how that hasn't really been a part of the conversation. And so I wanted to dig deeper personally, but also professionally into the intersection between mental health and sports in present day. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but really this is just a snapshot to show you all that mental health concerns are really prevalent among athletes. So we know that some of the most common mental health issues that athletes struggle with are depression, anxiety, eating disorders, substance use, and athletes are a lot more susceptible to developing some of these mental health issues because of things that only they experience as athletes, like having to balance the dual roles they have, dealing with burnout, dealing with the pressure to maintain their physical peak condition that make them more susceptible to developing some of these mental health issues. But the main thing that I want to point out on this slide, because it's very clear based on the statistics that clearly we know that mental health issues are a problem among athletes. But at the bottom of the slide, you'll see it says that student athletes have less favorable perceptions towards seeking help than their non-athlete peers. So this really got me thinking, and this is really what drove my own research around. So clearly there's something to how we're educating, how we're socializing athletes to think or believe that makes them less likely to have positive perceptions towards seeking help. So not only do they have less favorable attitudes towards seeking help, we actually know that athletes are less likely to seek help than their non-athlete peers as well. And some of the main barriers that the research has kind of provided us insight into why that is are listed below. But the main barrier that I really want to talk about and that really I centered my research around was stigma is the main leading barrier for why athletes are not seeking help. So that indicated to me that, again, we're somehow socializing our athletes to think, to believe, to act in certain ways. We're instilling values that maybe is potentially perpetuating some of this stigma. And so I wanted to understand that more specifically. What is it about that athlete identity that maybe is perpetuating the stigma of why athletes are less likely to get help? So your athlete identity is really just the level in which an athlete identifies with that role. So within that identity, the research talks about two different aspects. So the Hercules muscles and the Achilles heel. So this is just kind of a fancy way of saying the strengths and the weaknesses associated with that athlete identity. So a strength for being an athlete could be, being in peak physical condition. And for the Achilles heel, it could be, athletes are less likely to seek help. Interestingly, the research also tells us that athletes tend to oversubscribe to their athlete identity over every other part of themselves, and that this ultimately leads to identity foreclosure, which ultimately leads to being underdeveloped in other really important parts of themselves. So whether that's career identity or growing in their relationship with God, or developing just who they want to be and what their likes and dislikes are. These are all parts of ourselves that are potentially being neglected because athletes are oversubscribing to just their one specific part of their athlete identity. And I know from my own journey, I can really attest to that, because I remember being in college and kind of reaching this point in my own identity development where I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my career. And that was kind of the beginning for me where I started realizing that in a lot of ways, I think I had oversubscribed to that athlete identity. And therefore, it took me a couple years to figure out what I actually wanted to do and how I wanted to make a difference. Further, we know that athletes that tend to oversubscribe to their athlete identity are less likely to seek help. So again, this further reinforces that we know there is something to being an athlete that is playing a role, and maybe why athletes, there's this stigma of why they're not getting help. So in the bigger framework, so we have our athlete identity that's being developed in sports culture. So sports socialization is the process where individuals are learning their roles throughout their career. So this sports socialization process starts from the time that they enter sport until the time that they exit. So for me, started when I was 7 years old and swam until I was 19, so that's about 10 years that I was being socialized as an athlete and really taught what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, what are attitudes common of being an athlete, what are beliefs that are common of being an athlete, what are behaviors that are acceptable or not acceptable associated with being an athlete. And within that process of being socialized as an athlete, we have these different socialization agents. So parents, family, coaches, teammates, the media, culture, all of these different things are playing a role in how athletes are making sense of who they are, specifically what it means to be an athlete. So within the sports culture, there's clearly norms that are being developed and that are being fostered, a lot of which I think we've really paid a lot of attention to the positive norms and beliefs and behaviors associated with being an athlete, like being really mentally tough, being goal-oriented, being resilient. They're really positive things. But unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of research that has looked at the other side of the coin. So what are some norms that we're potentially teaching that could be harmful to athletes is what I was really interested in understanding more. So these are some common sports catchphrases that I think anyone that's grown up in the sports world, or let alone watched a sports movie, has probably heard these phrases before. No pain, no gain, winners don't quit, suck it up, shake it off, it's all in your head. And so this is what got me really thinking as I started reflecting on my own journey as an athlete. So what do these messages say about how we're socializing athletes to think, to behave, and to act? And not just in general in their life, but specifically my interest was, so what are the implications for this specifically for mental health? So I think the important thing to note about some of these common sports catchphrases is that they're not all bad. There are positive effects that I think kind of go along with some of those phrases, But again, I think we've paid a little bit too much attention to that aspect and not enough attention to how could these potentially be harmful. So again, some positive effects of, winners don't quit, no pain, no gain can be becoming very motivated and driven and hardworking. But some potentially negative effects could be potential injury, because if winners don't quit, then I have to push through my pain, whether that's physically, mentally. But really my interest specifically in my research was, so how could these specific messages be impacting athletes' openness to talking about mental health and likelihood of actually seeking help? So this is really what inspired this research study for me. So I was really interested in understanding two things. Number one, more specifically, what are the messages that athletes are receiving that are impacting their likelihood of seeking help? And then part two of that is, who are the people that are delivering these messages to athletes that are having the greatest impact on their openness and willingness to seek help? So for my research study, I interviewed 10 Division I athletes, both males and females, and they played a variety of different sports. So I think I had a swimmer, a tennis player, a golfer. So I really had a good diversity in terms of who I was interviewing in my sample. And I conducted a 1-hour interview with each of them to really understand more from their perspective what it means to be an athlete. What are some of the values associated with being an athlete? And then again, really targeting what are the messages that they're receiving for people in their lives that are impacting the stigma that potentially exists around mental health and them getting help, since we know that that is a big barrier of why athletes are not getting help. So essentially what I found, there were 3 different categories in terms of the results. So the participants reported hearing positive messages about seeking help, negative messages, and neutral and no messages from different people in their lives. Interestingly, there was actually reported a slightly higher number of positive messages than negative messages in this study. So I have 2 camps of thinking when I hear that. So my first is, this is exciting, this is good news, and this means that we're really working towards breaking the stigma that exists among athletes regarding seeking help. But there's another part of me that thinks, well, could athletes be underreporting some of these negative messages out of fear of feeling like they betrayed a coach or a teammate, and really feeding into the bigger picture issue of stigma that exists? So I think that's just an interesting thing to point out that had me scratching my head as a researcher and as a former athlete. So in terms of the positive messages, the main theme that came up that athletes reported in terms of messages that they received regarding that impacted their openness and willingness to seek help was, it's okay to not be okay. And then other variations of that included, it's okay to need help sometimes. It's okay if you're struggling and you need help. But ultimately, the athletes that reported hearing this message said that it made them, A, more open to talking about mental health, and B, made them more willing to actually seek professional help. So the next category was negative messages. So the main theme that emerged in this category was that athletes are supposed to be tough. And again, other variations of that were, you're weak if you need help, it's all in your head. So again, I think this really kind of reinforces this idea that there clearly are norms and values associated with what it means to be an athlete. And for a lot of the athletes that I interviewed that reported hearing this message, really talked about, being tough means that I shouldn't need help. I should be able to figure this out on my own. And so realizing that weakness was kind of associated with needing help really deterred athletes from talking about struggles that they were dealing with, and really deterred them from seeking professional help. So the last category that emerged was neutral and no messages. So the main theme that came up in that category was just, we didn't really talk about it. It wasn't really a part of the conversation. My coaches never said to me, hey, if you're having a problem, you should go see a therapist. And the really interesting thing about this, and probably the most notable takeaway out of this study that I did, was I found that athletes that reported receiving negative messages related to seeking help and athletes that reported receiving neutral or no messages, neither of them sought help. So I think that's really important for us to understand that, some of us are probably sitting here thinking, well, yeah, I've never really, said anything negative to my athletes about mental health or seeking help. But realizing that not having conversations about it and not being intentional about creating those positive messages ultimately perpetuates the stigma and leads to athletes not getting the help that they need. So in terms of the sources, so again, my first research question was, what were the messages? And then the part two was, who are the people that are communicating these messages and who has the greatest impact on whether or not you would seek help or not? So here's the list of all the different sources that my participants said that they received messages regarding seeking help. But the three bolded at the top were noted as the three sources that reported the highest frequency of messages and also were the most influential. So coaches, family, teammates, and friends were the most important and influential sources on whether or not athletes would seek help or not. So why am I sharing all this with you? I think it's really important for me, at least, to really draw a direct line of what's the point of this and why does this matter and what can we do with this information? And probably in a really short phrase, I would say intentional positive messaging matters, and that not having conversations about it just isn't good enough. And that's not going to work towards breaking the stigma that exists regarding mental health that athletes face. So ultimately, how important it is to be fostering a pro-mental health culture within sports. And not only through messaging and communication, but also through the actions that we're taking. How safe of an environment is in your locker room or your meeting room with your athletes to talk about mental health? Asking yourself things like that. How much access do your athletes have to a mental health provider? Has that been something you've talked about before? And then the second really big takeaway is understanding that everyone plays a really important role in breaking the stigma and supporting athletes' mental health. And that ultimately, we all have to be players. We all have to be playing the game. We can't be sitting on the sidelines when it comes to breaking the stigma. And I think it really comes with recognizing the accountability component of it, that from the coach to the parent of the athlete to the teammate, to the sports psychologist, whoever is involved, any other athletic personnel, how they are equally important to breaking this stigma so that athletes feel like they're able to get the help that they need. And while most of this has been, directly talking about mental health, I think when we think about our Christian walk, there's a lot of implications here as well related to ultimately, how is our relationship with Christ informing the messages that we're communicating either explicitly or implicitly in word and action to the athletes that we're around in our sports environments? So really thinking about, how does my relationship with Christ inform my leadership as a coach? How does it show up after we lose a game and it's a blowout and I'm really angry, but I'm really trying to demonstrate love and grace and compassion to my athletes? So I think that's another important piece, that as we're thinking about the bigger picture implications and the importance of really reflecting on the messages that we're communicating, I think there's our direct tie specifically in our walk with Christ that's important to be thinking about as well. So I kind of came up with a list of pro-mental health tips that I thought would be really concrete ways of thinking about, so what can we actually do with this information? We hear the research, we know that this is a problem, so what can we actively be doing beyond just the messaging to work towards breaking the stigma? And again, none of these things are specifically revolutionary, but if implemented, they can have a huge impact. So the first is just having more conversations. which again is a really important takeaway from my study in general. It's super important that we work towards normalizing mental health struggles among athletes. If we know, based on my study, they talked about, fear of being perceived as weak is such a big part of that informing the stigma. We have to make sure we're doing a good job of indicating that it's okay to struggle. It's okay as an athlete to need help. And that doesn't mean that something's wrong with you. It doesn't mean you're crazy, and it doesn't mean you're weak. And you don't have to be a counselor like me to validate your athlete's stress. And I think that's a really important thing, is realizing that something as simple as saying it's okay not to be okay, how big of an impact that can have. And we can all do that, whether we're a counselor like me, a parent, or a coach. The second tip is just prioritizing physical health and mental health equally. That's really, really critical. As athletes, and specifically when I think about being a collegiate athlete, we would do physical annual exams every year. So why aren't we doing that in terms of mental health screenings as well? And I think, integrating some type of screening into our locker rooms could be really incremental in taking steps towards communicating to players that, hey, not only does your physical health matter, but your mental health matters as well. The other part to that is, how much access do your athletes have to a sports counselor like me or a sports psychologist? And I know this looks different at different levels of sport, so in the collegiate environment, some have more access to like sports psychologists or sports counselors. But at a club or organizational level, do you know a counselor in the community that works specifically with youth athletes? And just knowing what your resources are is really important and related to, if my athlete is struggling, I know who to refer you to. And then the last piece of that is educating yourself. So having workshops or some type of psychoeducational forum for coaches, for athletes, for parents. And again, that kind of goes back to, we're all players and we all play a part in breaking the stigma that exists among athletes regarding mental health. And then checking in with your athletes or teammates. This seems super simple, but how intentional are we? I said that intentional positive messaging, the same thing. How intentional are you being when you do check in with your daughter or your son who's an athlete, or your player if you're a coach, and really asking them, how are you feeling mentally and emotionally? How has your stress been over the past week? And how can I support you? And just having more of those conversations is really important, and again works towards normalizing that it's okay to have struggles. And then the last thing is just encouraging athletes to seek informal and formal help if they need it. Is so critical. So one of the biggest myths regarding counseling is that you need to be in a crisis to actually seek help, and that's just not true at all. There's no problem too small and no problem too big that wouldn't warrant talking to a counselor. And just like as athletes, we're constantly working towards strengthening our muscles to be the best athlete we can be and perform in the best way we can. It's the same thing with our mental health. Our mental health is a muscle that needs to be exercised. And a big part of that exercising process is being open and willing to seek help if you need it. And then the last piece, again, is just being aware of what resources you have in your community to support your athlete's mental health. So my final slide, I just wanted to kind of summarize everything I've talked about using an acronym, again, to further being concrete and just having kind of a takeaway. If you don't take anything else away from anything I'm saying, kind of using this one slide as a manual for moving forward of how you can create a better environment that really fosters, a pro mental health space. So again, the S is strategically integrating more mental health into the conversations that you're having, prioritizing checking in with your teammates, being intentional in how you're doing that, openly encouraging your teammates and our athletes to seek help, reflecting on the messages that you're communicating to your athletes and or teammates about mental health. Are you communicating positive messages, negative messages, or have you not been communicating any messages at all? And another piece I would add to that is reflecting on the messages that you received growing up. regarding seeking help. And whether you're an athlete, you were an athlete growing up or not, I think that's really important. And maybe that's just the counselor in me talking, but really taking a step back to reflect on your own personal journey and how that's influencing the messages that you are or not communicating to your athletes. But ultimately, our goal, whether it's a parent or a coach or a teammate, we want our athletes to be the best that they can be on and off the field. And a big part of that is supporting their physical, mental, and spiritual growth. Because ultimately we want them to not only perform well, but we want them to be well. And ultimately striving for greatness. And I think a big piece of that is realizing that mental health has to be a part of the conversation for athletes to be great and to be the best that they can be. So I hope that you can take all of this and really think about how can I start implementing and creating a safer space for my athletes where I'm really supporting their mental health and encouraging them to get the help that they need.
Thanks, Aviry. Thank you for your thoughtful and personable presentation on a topic that's very, very relevant. And we have some incredible questions that have been coming in. So I'm just going to start off with a really good question here. Did you find a difference in responses between male and female athlete responses? And does gender play a role in how mental health is addressed?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I only had about 10 athletes that I interviewed. So interestingly, in my study, there wasn't a big gender difference in terms of responses and messages that they received. But I think a big part of that was because of my sample size and not having enough athletes, specifically males represented as well. But what I will say is some of the men that I did interview that were athletes did talk about the stereotypes of what it means to be a man, not just an athlete, but the intersection of those identities around norms that I can't be weak and I can't struggle as a male. And also the pressure as an athlete, that kind of combined pressure that just further reinforces that idea that I can't be weak. So in terms of my implications, it wasn't a massive takeaway, but while I was interviewing a few of the male athletes, that did come up in the conversation.
That was also another question, and you hit on that related to the male athletes. So what, just as a follow-up, and then I have another question, how might coaches help? You mentioned it, but how might they help a little bit more to give permission and create that safe community to check in with them and see how they're doing? What are there any catchphrases or anything to be okay with not being okay?
I mean, I think, I said in the presentation, I think we have to have this like rah, great speech, but I really believe it starts with something as simple as, I just want you to know it's okay to struggle. And if you need help, we have resources available for you that you can access. And that's, again, I would just reinforce the point that it doesn't take anything monumental to make such a difference. When I was interviewing these athletes, I was really encouraged to hear that a parent or a coach saying something as simple as, hey, it's okay to struggle. That doesn't mean that you're weak, and we all need help sometimes. To hear how big of a difference that made really was encouraging to me and made me further realize that there's no, it doesn't need to be a magic formula. It's just about having those intentional short phrases of, it's okay to struggle. I'm here if you need me. We have help if you need it. It starts with the coach, and if that is normalized from the coach, the person that I really look up to, then I'm going to be more open to seeking help. And I think another important piece that I didn't hit on was, especially when I interviewed my D1 athletes, they talked about the fear of their coach hearing that they were struggling and the fear around that. So the breach of confidentiality and all of that. So I think maybe from a coach's perspective, letting them know that if they do seek help from a counselor in the department or in the community, that that's a safe space and that is a confidential space. And I don't need to know, and well, technically they're ethically not allowed to know any of that dialogue that they're having. But I think as coaches, that could be a very important step to say. And if you're struggling, know that it's okay. And none of that's going to get relayed back to me, because that was actually a big fear that a lot of my athletes that I interviewed reported.
One other question, and related to it in some way, you said it starts with the coaches. Let's go back to when they're little. How can parents help nurture that open conversation? Oftentimes parents live vicariously through their children, which is a bad idea for identity. So how can we reverse some of those trends?
I think it starts with having informal conversations at home, thinking about, I remember every day when my parents would pick me up, checking in with me. How are you doing? How is your day? And same thing after practice, and I think, like I said in the presentation, I really think opening the door to, hey, how are you doing and how are you feeling, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally, using that verbiage, because like I said, with my experience, not using that language of mental health, I think really impacted me in terms of I didn't receive any messages. So I didn't really think it was okay to talk about it as much or to value it as much. So even something as simple as mentioning and naming it and labeling it for what it is, mental health. How is your mental health? And I think there's kind of a taboo of checking in that manner, but I would challenge that there shouldn't be, and that we should be having those dialogues. And I think especially as you see more and more athletes, professional athletes that are coming out and talking about their mental health struggles, like Michael Phelps, Kevin Love, that could be a great way to talk about athlete mental health, using what we see in culture and in the media as a conversational talking point with kids, to open that door as well.
That's great. And I just got to say, your dad did a little shout out here, and he indicated that as a professional coach, that they have professionals in the house that athletes can go, and they have complete privacy. So just to accentuate the point that you made earlier, Aviry, here's a good question, a great point that's raised. The statistics that you provided are alarming, this attendee indicated, but they're also from studies from 2005 and 2007. Have the percentages risen in the last 10 years?
Yes, and honestly, those dates of those studies just further indicate how there is a sparsity of research and scarcity of research on this topic. Because it's interesting, I graduated from my PhD program not that long ago, and I was having to pull from citations from a long time ago because there's not a lot of research on mental health issues among athletes, which further reinforces the importance of having more studies done to get a better understanding and picture of what are present day statistics that are really representative of mental health issues among athletes.
That's great. Here's another great question. We were just talking about it. Did you see any difference when you looked at different sports? Any kind of comparison there as far as mental health concerns?
Yes, interestingly, so athletes that played individual sports had greater stigma and were less likely to seek help than athletes that were in team sports. And I mean, I have a lot of different hypotheses about why that maybe is. You could start on a very fundamental level of, as an individual athlete, it all rides on you, and you're relying on yourself to be, on all the time, to be performing well all the time. So you become very self-reliant in maybe a way that athletes who play team sports don't have to do. But that's one of those things actually that I would want to do a follow-up study on, specifically digging deeper into getting more insight into why that is.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And it makes sense when you say that, with the team that can shoulder more of the burden. I have a question, and this hits home for us as well in different ways. What if there were really negative messages that hurt your identity and you're done with your competitive sports, but your identity is still impacted by that? What free counseling advice right now might you give this individual who asked this question?
Go to counseling. No, no. I mean, I joke, but I'm totally serious. I mean, if you're realizing that, and you're stepping back and reflecting on, wow, there are some really negative messages that I received, or even reflecting on, yeah, there were some parts of being an athlete that were really difficult for me that I haven't processed through. I really believe that it starts in counseling. And I'll just share from my own personal experience. When I was an athlete, I never sought counseling. I had an injury, a career-ending injury that was really difficult for me, and I struggled with my transition out of sport. But it wasn't until my master's program that I actually went to counseling for the first time. So I think, I've learned how influential and how impactful that is, and just having the time to sit down and really reflect on working through some of those things. And again, like I said in my presentation, I wasn't in a state of crisis. And I think that I had my own self-stigma that got in the way of me even seeking help. But as I took that step and realized it's okay to sit down and process through the grief and the anxiety and the confusion that I have transitioning out of sport, and even maybe working through some really difficult dynamics in the sports world, whether it was dealing with a difficult relationship with a parent that pushed them too hard, or working with a coach that yelled at them all the time. That's a great thing to talk to a counselor about. And if you don't feel comfortable taking that step yet and talking to a counselor, it starts with confiding in someone that you trust and sharing your story. And I think that's something I'm continuing to learn, how empowering it is to be able to own and share and talk about your lived experiences of being an athlete. And as I've done that more and more over the past, honestly, 5 years, I continue to learn things about myself and about my former experiences that I wouldn't have been able to learn if I had not taken that step to talk to friends and family, but also to talk to a counselor myself.
Thank you.
That's great advice. Let me put the skeptic's hat on. So I'm a coach, and I'm concerned about performance. That's what I get paid for. Is there any evidence or research for those who actually attend to the things you're talking about, becoming more vulnerable and getting in tune with their emotions, that it actually positively affects their performance?
Yes, there is research out there that suggests that by addressing your mental health, that's going to foster a better performance. And why is that? So if I, for example, have an anxiety disorder, what are some symptoms that are kind of go along with that? I'm not sleeping well at night. I have strained relationships. I'm, on edge all the time. So having all of those side effects and symptoms associated with, for example, a mental health disorder, if I'm not managing those and coping with those, that's going to interfere with my physical performance. And with any mental health, issue that you're dealing with, it does impact you somatically. It does impact you physically. So trying to separate mental health and physical health, and I think that's the whole point have been trying to make here, is that we've been putting them in two separate camps, but we should be looking at them in the same camp, because by addressing your mental health, not only are they going to be a healthier person, but they're going to be a better athlete. They're going to be able to be more focused and more relaxed and really hit their peak performance if I'm able to get my anxiety, my depression, my suicidality under control.
Wow, that's great. I'm ready to play for you. Let's go. Yes. So thank you so much. And we're winding down on time here. In a moment, we're going to take a few minutes break. But Dr. Kurt Thompson has this line. It says that we enter the world looking for somebody looking for us. I love that line, and what you are sharing with us is that people want to be seen and heard. They want to know that their life, broken as we all are in different ways, want other people involved. And so much of what you're talking about as a Christian community, to get just to listen and sit with people and be involved. So one more question, or do we need to wrap this one up?
One more question. If one of the great identity lies is I am what I do, how do you suggest we help coaches and athletes to redefine their identity?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And that I think that really transcends athletics, you know, because I think a lot of our value and our worth we associate with what we do, whether that's your career, your job, or being an athlete. And I think a big piece of that is exercising and developing and growing in other areas. Because if I am putting all of my energy and all of my time into just developing one part of myself, then of course that is going to be where all of my self-worth comes from. So by taking a step back and realizing that there's so many different parts to me as a person outside of being an athlete or being a professional, and really being intentional about growing those other areas, I believe that that will make it easier to realize that I'm not just my job. I'm not just my sport. I'm Aviry the friend. I'm Aviry the counselor. I'm Aviry the daughter. I have all these different parts of my identities that's helping me buffer the belief that my worth is only tied to what I do.